Bristow name had been whispered in hushed tones throughout New England for generations, but never with the disgust it deserved. In the autumn of 1997, a construction crew renovating a crumbling Victorian mansion in Portland, Maine, discovered something that would rewrite history. Behind a false wall in what had once been a study, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved by sheer chance, lay a leather-bound diary dated 1894. The handwriting inside was elegant, measured, and belonged to Elizabeth Bristow, a woman history had painted as a devoted wife and philanthropist. But the words on those yellowed pages told a different story entirely. They confessed to crimes so calculated, so methodical, that even hardened detectives who read them felt their skin crawl. For over a century, the Bristow family had been remembered as pillars of their community, victims of unfortunate circumstances and tragic losses. The diary proved otherwise. Portland in the late 1800s was a bustling port city, where shipping magnates built fortunes and reputations with equal fervor. The Bristow mansion stood on Congress Street, a towering testament to wealth and status. Its stone facade and wrought iron gates spoke of permanence, of a family that intended to leave its mark on history. Inside, the rooms were filled with imported furniture, oil paintings in gilded frames, and Persian rugs that muffled footsteps. It was the kind of home where secrets could be kept easily, where closed doors meant privacy was absolute, and where the staff knew better than to ask questions about what happened in the family's private quarters. Thomas Bristow had made his fortune in timber and shipping. By 1890, he owned 3 lumber mills and a fleet of merchant vessels that transported goods up and down the Atlantic coast. He was respected in business circles, feared by competitors, and admired by those who saw only his public face. His wife, Elizabeth, was known for her charity work. She organized fundraisers for the Portland Orphan Asylum, hosted teas for the Ladies' Aid Society, and was photographed regularly for the society pages of the Portland Press-Herald. Their 2 children, Margaret and William, attended the finest schools and were groomed to carry on the family legacy. But beneath this veneer of respectability, something far darker was unfolding. The first hint came in March 1891, when Thomas's business partner, Robert Caldwell, died suddenly at age 42. The official cause was listed as heart failure, unremarkable for a man known to enjoy rich food and expensive cigars. The funeral was well attended, and Thomas delivered a moving eulogy about friendship and loss. No one questioned it. No one had reason to. 3 months later, Thomas's younger brother, James, drowned in Casco Bay during what was described as a fishing accident. The body was recovered 2 days later, bloated and unrecognizable. Again, tragedy was accepted as simply that, tragedy. The Bristows mourned publicly and retreated into their mansion to grieve privately. What Portland society didn't know was that both deaths had been carefully orchestrated. Elizabeth's diary would later reveal that Robert Caldwell had discovered financial irregularities in the company books. He had confronted Thomas privately, threatening to expose him unless the matter was resolved. Thomas, unwilling to risk his reputation, had consulted his wife. Elizabeth, always pragmatic, had suggested a solution that left no room for exposure or scandal. She had access to her father's old medical books, including texts on poisons and their symptoms. Digitalis, derived from foxglove plants, could mimic heart failure perfectly when administered in the right doses. It was untraceable in 1891, and doctors rarely questioned a diagnosis that fit the symptoms. The plan had worked flawlessly with Robert Caldwell, but James Bristow's death required a different approach. James had been asking too many questions about his brother's sudden wealth expansion, about properties purchased under different names, about money that seemed to flow through accounts without proper documentation. He wasn't threatening exposure like Caldwell had, but his curiosity was dangerous nonetheless. Elizabeth suggested the fishing trip, knowing that James, who fancied himself an outdoorsman, would never refuse. Thomas arranged everything: the boat, the location, even the weather forecast. On a grey June morning, the 2 brothers sailed out into Casco Bay. Only one returned. Thomas told investigators that James had been drinking, that he had lost his balance while trying to reel in a large fish, that the waves had been rougher than expected. He described his frantic attempts to reach his brother, how the cold water had made it impossible to dive deep enough, how he had called for help until his voice was raw. The story was believable because Thomas himself believed it by the time he repeated it to the authorities. He had practiced the narrative so many times in his mind that it became his truth. Elizabeth had coached him well. She understood that the best lies were the ones the liar believed completely. The investigation concluded within a week. Accidental drowning. Case closed. The Bristow family received condolences and sympathy. No one suspected murder. But Elizabeth's diary entries from that period reveal a woman who felt no remorse, only satisfaction. She wrote about the necessity of protecting their position, about how weak men like Robert and James threatened everything they had built. She described Thomas as brilliant in business, but lacking the spine for difficult decisions. She saw herself as the strength behind the throne, the one who made the hard choices that ensured their family's continued prominence. In her neat, flowing script, she detailed how she had researched each method, how she had calculated dosages, how she had created opportunities that appeared natural and beyond suspicion. She wrote about it with the same detachment one might use to describe planning a dinner party or organizing household accounts. The deaths continued, though less frequently. In 1892, a maid named Catherine Murphy, who had witnessed an argument between Thomas and Elizabeth about the Caldwell situation, disappeared. The official story was that she had left employment without notice, probably to return to her family in Boston. Elizabeth's diary told a different version. Catherine had overheard too much, had started asking questions about Mr. Caldwell's sudden death, had noticed Elizabeth's interest in her father's medical texts. Catherine's body was never found, but Elizabeth described in detail how arsenic mixed into evening tea had made the girl violently ill, how she had been moved to a storage room in the basement while the household slept, how her body had been wrapped in canvas and weighted with stones before being deposited in the Fall River on a moonless night. By 1893, the Bristow fortune had doubled. Thomas had acquired Caldwell's share of the business for a fraction of its value from Robert's widow, who knew nothing about finances and trusted Thomas to handle everything fairly. James's inheritance had passed to Thomas as the surviving brother. Properties were consolidated, investments expanded, and the Bristow name became synonymous with success. Elizabeth played her role perfectly, the gracious hostess, the devoted mother, the charitable society woman. She smiled at the right people, said the right things, and never let anyone see the calculating mind behind those pleasant features. She had learned early in life that women who showed too much intelligence were viewed with suspicion, so she hid hers behind a facade of gentle femininity and domestic concern. The children were not spared from their mother's manipulations, though they never knew it. Margaret, the eldest at 16, had fallen in love with a young clerk named Daniel Foster, who worked at one of the city's smaller banks. He was handsome, earnest, and completely unsuitable for a Bristow daughter. Elizabeth recognized immediately that this romance threatened the advantageous marriage she had been planning with the Harrison family, whose son stood to inherit a railroad fortune. She couldn't simply forbid the relationship. That would only make Margaret more determined. Instead, Elizabeth employed subtler methods. She befriended Daniel's mother, a washerwoman who lived in the Munjoy Hill neighborhood, where Portland's working-class families crowded into narrow wooden houses. Elizabeth visited under the pretense of charity work, bringing food baskets and offering kind words. She learned everything about the Foster family, their debts, their struggles, their hopes. Then she went to Daniel directly. She offered him money, a substantial sum, enough to pay off his family's debts and start a new life in New York. All he had to do was leave Portland and never contact Margaret again. She framed it as an act of love, letting Margaret have the life she deserved, the opportunities her station afforded, rather than dragging her down into poverty and struggle. Daniel, who genuinely cared for Margaret, agonized over the decision for 3 days. But his mother was ill, his younger siblings needed food, and the debts were crushing them. He took Elizabeth's money and disappeared one Thursday morning, leaving only a brief note that said he had realized they wanted different things from life. Margaret was heartbroken. She locked herself in her room for a week, refusing meals and weeping until her eyes were swollen. Elizabeth comforted her daughter with practiced sympathy, holding her while she cried, assuring her that time would heal the wound. that she would find someone worthy of her affections. Within 6 months, Margaret was engaged to Richard Harrison. The wedding was the social event of 1894. William, the younger child at 14, presented different challenges. He was intelligent, observant, and had begun asking questions about the family's business practices. He had overheard conversations he shouldn't have, had noticed inconsistencies in his father's stories, had seen his mother's late-night sessions in the study with ledgers and documents spread across the desk. Elizabeth recognized the danger. William was too much like her, too smart, too curious, too willing to dig for truth. She couldn't eliminate him as she had others. He was her son, and even Elizabeth's cold pragmatism had limits. Instead, she decided to control him through education. She convinced Thomas to send William to boarding school in Massachusetts, arguing that he needed the discipline and social connections that came from attending Phillips Exeter Academy. Thomas agreed, seeing it as an investment in his son's future. William protested, wanting to stay in Portland, but his parents were firm. In September 1893, he boarded a train south, away from the mansion and its secrets. Elizabeth wrote regularly, warm letters full of maternal affection and advice. She asked about his studies, his friends, his plans. She never mentioned business or family matters beyond superficial updates. She was building distance, ensuring that when William eventually returned, he would be so removed from the family's daily operations that he would never piece together what had happened during his absence. The diary entries from 1894 show Elizabeth at the height of her power and confidence. She had successfully eliminated threats, arranged her daughter's advantageous marriage, and secured her son's future while keeping him ignorant of the family's darker activities. The Bristow fortune was stable, growing, and above suspicion. Thomas relied on her completely, consulting her on every major decision. She had become the true power in the family, operating from the shadows while her husband served as the public face. She wrote about feeling invincible, about the thrill of manipulating circumstances and people to achieve her desired outcomes. But that same confidence led to carelessness. In May 1894, Elizabeth began documenting everything in her diary. She wrote about past crimes in detail, describing methods and motivations with disturbing clarity. She included dates, names, and specific information about how each death had been arranged. Historians and psychologists who later studied the diary debated why she did this. Some suggested it was arrogance, a belief that she would never be caught and therefore could safely record her triumphs. Others argued it was a need for recognition, even if only from herself, of her intelligence and capability. Still others believed it was simpler, that she genuinely saw nothing wrong with what she had done and viewed the diary as a practical record, no different from household accounts or social calendars. Whatever her motivation, the diary became a comprehensive confession. She wrote about selecting poisons from her father's old medical collection, about studying symptoms and dosages, about the satisfaction of watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. She described Robert Caldwell's funeral and how she had stood beside his widow, offering comfort while knowing she had caused the grief she was supposedly helping to ease. She wrote about James Bristow's drowning with clinical detachment, noting the water temperature and how long a body would take to surface under various conditions. She detailed Catherine Murphy's final hours with the same tone one might use to describe canning vegetables or arranging flowers. The entries from late 1894 suggest Elizabeth was contemplating expanding her activities. Thomas's health was declining. He was drinking heavily, suffering from stress-related ailments and showing signs of the guilt that Elizabeth seemed immune to. She wrote about considering whether he had become a liability, whether his increasing instability might lead him to confess or make mistakes that would draw attention. She noted that his life insurance policy was substantial, and that his death would leave her in complete control of the family fortune. She researched various methods that could simulate natural causes in a man of his age and condition. She made lists, drew diagrams, and calculated probabilities with the same attention to detail she applied to planning charity events. But Elizabeth never implemented those plans. In December 1894, Thomas died suddenly of what doctors diagnosed as a stroke. The irony was not lost on Elizabeth, who wrote in her diary that fate had accomplished what she had been planning, saving her the trouble and risk. She noted that his death was convenient timing, after Margaret's wedding but before William's return from school, giving her time to consolidate power and make arrangements without interference. She described the funeral arrangements with satisfaction, pleased that everything reflected well on the family's standing. She wrote about her widow's weeds and how black suited her complexion, about the condolence visits from Portland's elite, about the respectful obituaries in the newspapers. She had won completely, or so she believed. Elizabeth's reign as the widow Bristow lasted 3 years, from 1894 to 1897. During that time, she transformed from a wealthy woman dependent on her husband's business acumen into one of Portland's most formidable independent operators. She took control of the timber mills and shipping operations with a confidence that surprised the men who had worked with Thomas. They had expected her to sell the businesses or hire a male manager to handle affairs. Instead, she attended board meetings, reviewed contracts personally, and made decisions that proved both shrewd and profitable. The company expanded under her leadership, acquiring 2 additional mills and opening new shipping routes to Canada. Her success in business was matched by her continued prominence in Portland society. She chaired fundraising committees, hosted elaborate dinner parties at the Congress Street mansion, and maintained the appearance of a respectable widow dedicated to her children's welfare and the community's betterment. Margaret had married Richard Harrison and moved to Boston, where she was establishing herself in that city's social circles. William had graduated from Phillips Exeter and was attending Harvard, studying law, with the intention of eventually joining the family business. Elizabeth corresponded regularly with both children, playing the role of devoted mother while carefully managing their expectations and involvement in family affairs. But the diary entries from this period reveal growing paranoia. Elizabeth began to worry about loose ends, about people who might know too much or suspect too much. She wrote about sleepless nights spent reviewing every conversation, every interaction, searching for signs that someone had pieced together the pattern of death surrounding the Bristow family. She became convinced that Thomas's personal secretary, a man named Albert Chen who had worked for the family for 15 years, knew more than he should. Chen was Chinese-American, part of Portland's small but established Asian community, and he had handled much of Thomas's correspondence and financial records. He was meticulous, intelligent, and observant, exactly the kind of person who might have noticed irregularities. Elizabeth's solution was characteristically direct. In March 1897, she offered Chen a generous retirement package and a glowing letter of recommendation, praising his years of loyal service. She framed it as recognition of his dedication, a reward for his hard work. Chen, who was 58 and had been considering retirement anyway, accepted gratefully. He moved to San Francisco to live with his daughter's family, taking with him his memories of the Bristow household, but no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Elizabeth noted in her diary that distance was sometimes the best insurance. Chen was unlikely to speak about suspicions he might harbor, when doing so would gain him nothing, and he was 3,000 miles away. The final diary entry was dated November 1897. Elizabeth wrote about feeling tired, about the constant vigilance required to maintain her position and protect her secrets. She described the weight of keeping everything hidden, of always calculating her words and actions, of never being able to truly trust anyone. But she also wrote about pride. Pride in what she had built, in how she had transformed the Bristow family from merely wealthy to genuinely powerful, in the respect she commanded despite operating in a world designed to exclude women from such positions. She wrote that she had done what was necessary, that she had no regrets, and that history would judge her accomplishments, not her methods. Then the entries stopped. Elizabeth lived for another 34 years, dying in 1931 at age 73. During those decades, she never wrote another word in the diary. Whether she destroyed other volumes, whether she simply stopped documenting her life, or whether she had said everything she needed to say remains unknown. The single 1894 diary, hidden behind that false wall, was the only record of her confessions. She took whatever other secrets she possessed to her grave in Portland's Evergreen Cemetery, where she was buried beside Thomas in a plot marked by an impressive granite monument that proclaimed the Bristow family's importance for anyone who cared to read the inscriptions. The mansion remained in Bristow hands until 1952, when William's daughter sold it to a real estate developer. It passed through several owners over the following decades, each making minor renovations, but never discovering the hidden compartment in the study. The false wall was expertly constructed, designed to look like solid structural support, and it had kept its secret for over a century until those construction workers finally broke through it in 1997. The discovery of Elizabeth's diary sent shockwaves through Portland and beyond. The construction foreman, a man named Jack Morrison, who had worked in renovation for 25 years, later described the moment they found it. His crew had been removing old plaster to expose the original brick walls, intending to restore the Victorian character of the study. When they hit what should have been solid wall, they heard a hollow sound instead. Curious, they carefully removed more plaster and discovered a space roughly 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, sealed on all sides. Inside was the diary, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and decay, along with several other items. A small vial containing traces of white powder, later identified as arsenic, a collection of newspaper clippings about the deaths Elizabeth had orchestrated, and a leather pouch containing jewelry that had belonged to Catherine Murphy, the murdered maid. Morrison called the police immediately, recognizing that what they had found was potentially evidence of historical crimes. Portland Police Department sent Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Albert Chen, who specialized in cold cases. She arrived at the mansion within an hour. Wearing gloves and treating the scene with the same care she would give any active investigation. She photographed everything in place before carefully removing the items for analysis. The diary was in remarkably good condition, its pages slightly yellowed but completely readable. Elizabeth's handwriting was clear, elegant, and disturbingly matter-of-fact, as it described murders and manipulations spanning several years. Detective Chen spent 3 months authenticating the diary and investigating Elizabeth's claims. She worked with historians who verified the dates and events mentioned, with forensic document examiners who confirmed the diary's age and the consistency of the handwriting throughout, and with genealogists who tracked down living descendants of the Bristow family and their victims. The verification process was exhaustive because the implications were enormous. This diary was rewriting over a century of accepted history about one of Portland's founding families. Every detail had to be confirmed, every claim corroborated where possible, before any public announcement could be made. The forensic evidence supported Elizabeth's confessions. The white powder in the vial tested positive for arsenic trioxide, a common poison in the late 19th century that was often used in rat control and had been readily available. Chemical analysis of the vial matched manufacturing techniques from that era. Catherine Murphy's jewelry, a simple silver cross and matching earrings, were verified through photographs found in the Portland Orphan Asylum's records, where Catherine had lived before entering domestic service. The asylum kept detailed records of their residence, including inventories of personal possessions, and the jewelry matched those descriptions exactly. The newspaper clippings Elizabeth had saved were authentic, their paper and ink consistent with late 1800s printing methods, and the articles described the deaths of Robert Caldwell, James Bristow, and others exactly as Elizabeth had recounted in her diary. Detective Chen also located records that had been overlooked or misinterpreted at the time of the deaths. Robert Caldwell's physician had noted in his private records, not the official death certificate, that the heart failure seemed unusually sudden for a man with no prior cardiac symptoms. James Bristow's drowning had included a brief notation in the Coast Guard report about bruising on the body that could have indicated a struggle, but it had been attributed to the body being battered by rocks and debris in the water. Catherine Murphy's disappearance had generated a missing person report filed by her sister, who insisted Catherine would never have left without saying goodbye, but the investigation had been cursory at best. Police in the 1890s had given little attention to the disappearance of a domestic servant, especially one who was Irish and Catholic, in a predominantly Protestant city power structure. The diary also revealed Elizabeth's connection to other suspicious deaths that had never been linked to the Bristow family. A business competitor of Thomas's had died in a house fire in 1893. Elizabeth's diary described how she had paid a man to create an electrical fault in the competitor's home office, making it appear accidental. A woman who had been blackmailing Thomas over an affair had died of apparent food poisoning in 1895. Elizabeth detailed how she had befriended the woman, invited her to tea, and served pastries laced with enough contaminated meat to cause fatal illness. The public revelation came in January 1998, when Detective Chen held a press conference at Portland City Hall. The room was packed with journalists, historians, and descendants of the families involved in Elizabeth's crimes. Chen presented her findings methodically, showing slides of diary pages, forensic reports, and historical documents that corroborated Elizabeth's confessions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Elizabeth Bristow, celebrated philanthropist and respected society matron, had been a calculating serial killer who had murdered at least 6 people, and possibly more over a span of several years. The Bristow family name, which had been honored with street names and plaques throughout Portland, was suddenly synonymous with deception and murder. The reaction was immediate and intense. William Bristow's grandson, Robert Bristow III, who was 72 years old and living in Connecticut, issued a statement expressing shock and horror. He described his great-grandmother as someone he had known only through family stories, a strong woman who had built a business empire, a devoted mother who had ensured her children's success, a pillar of Portland society. The diary revealed a completely different person, and Robert struggled to reconcile the family mythology with the documented reality. He offered formal apologies to the descendants of Elizabeth's victims and pledged to cooperate fully with any further investigations or historical research into the family's past. The descendants of Robert Caldwell and James Bristow expressed a mixture of vindication and grief. For generations, their families had suspected something wrong about those deaths, but had lacked evidence to challenge the official narratives. Caldwell's great-great-grandson, Michael Caldwell, spoke at the press conference about how his family had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance, how Robert's widow had been manipulated into selling her share of the business for far less than its value, how the Caldwell children had grown up in modest circumstances, while the Bristows prospered on wealth that was partially stolen. James Bristow's descendants shared similar stories of lost opportunities and financial struggles that might have been avoided if James had lived and maintained his share of the family fortune. Catherine Murphy's case generated particular outrage because her family had tried to investigate her disappearance and had been dismissed by authorities who saw her as just another immigrant servant who had moved on to other employment. Her great-great-niece, Kathleen Murphy O'Brien, spoke emotionally about how her family had been told for over a century that Catherine had abandoned them, that she had cared so little for her relatives that she had left without a word. The diary proved that Catherine had been murdered specifically because she was observant and intelligent, because she had noticed things the Bristows wanted hidden, and because her lowly social position made her vulnerable. O'Brien called for a formal memorial to Catherine and the other victims, arguing that their stories deserved to be remembered and honored. The city of Portland faced difficult decisions about how to handle the Bristow legacy. Congress Street, where the mansion still stood, had a section named Bristow Boulevard in honor of the family's contributions to the city's development. The Portland Maritime Museum had an entire wing named after Thomas Bristow, celebrating his role in establishing shipping routes and building the local economy. The Portland Orphan Asylum, which had been renamed the Bristow Children's Center in the 1950s after receiving a large bequest from William Bristow's estate, carried the family name on its buildings and programs. All of these honors suddenly seemed inappropriate, even obscene, given what Elizabeth's diary had revealed about how that wealth and influence had been acquired. Mayor Patricia Morrison appointed a special committee to review the historical record and make recommendations about the Bristow legacy. The committee included historians, ethicists, community leaders, and representatives from the families of Elizabeth's victims. They met for 6 months, reviewing documents, hearing testimonies, and debating the complex questions raised by the diary's discovery. Should the city remove the Bristow name from public spaces and buildings? Should the family's philanthropic contributions be acknowledged despite the crimes that generated the wealth? How should history remember Elizabeth Bristow? As a murderer who happened to do some charitable work, or as a complex figure whose actions reflected both the possibilities and the moral failures of her era. The committee's final report, released in August 1998, recommended a nuanced approach that acknowledged both the crimes and the historical complexity. Bristow Boulevard was renamed Remembrance Way, honoring all the victims of the crimes described in the diary. The Maritime Museum redesigned its Thomas Bristow wing to include information about Elizabeth's crimes and how the family fortune was built, partly through murder and manipulation. The museum added exhibits about other historical crimes in Portland's past, contextualizing the Bristow case within broader discussions of justice, accountability, and how societies reckon with uncomfortable truths about their founders. The Bristow Children's Center kept its name, but added a memorial garden dedicated to Catherine Murphy and the other victims, with plaques explaining the full history and acknowledging the painful truths the diary had revealed. Elizabeth's diary itself became a subject of intense scholarly interest. Criminologists studied it for insights into the psychology of serial killers, particularly female murderers, who operated in domestic and social spheres rather than through overtly violent means. Historians analyzed it for what it revealed about women's agency and power in the late 19th century, about how someone as intelligent and capable as Elizabeth had found outlets for her ambitions in a society that severely limited women's options. Literary scholars examined the writing itself, the elegant prose, the organizational structure, the complete lack of remorse or moral anguish that characterized most confessional writings. Ethicists debated whether the diary should be made fully public or kept restricted to researchers, given its disturbing content and the privacy concerns of living descendants. The Portland Historical Society acquired the diary along with the other items found in the hidden compartment and made them available to qualified researchers, while also creating a carefully curated public exhibit. The exhibit included selected diary passages, photographs of the Bristow family and their victims, contextual information about Portland in the 1890s, and interactive displays that allowed visitors to explore the ethical questions raised by the case. It attracted thousands of visitors in its first year, becoming one of the museum's most popular and controversial exhibits. Some visitors found it ghoulish, arguing that displaying the tools and confessions of a murderer celebrated violence rather than educating about it. Others praised it for honestly confronting uncomfortable history and refusing to sanitize the past. The legal implications of Elizabeth's confessions were complex, but ultimately limited. All the crimes she described had occurred over a century ago, and all the perpetrators and direct victims were long dead. There were no prosecutions possible, no legal remedies available to the victims' families beyond moral recognition of the injustices committed. Some descendants filed civil suits seeking portions of the Bristow estate, arguing that their ancestors had been defrauded or murdered for money that rightfully belonged to them. These cases moved slowly through the courts, hampered by the passage of time, the complexity of tracing assets over multiple generations, and the legal principle that estates eventually close and cannot be reopened indefinitely. Most were eventually settled out of court, with the Bristow descendants making financial contributions to charitable foundations established in the victims' names rather than engaging in prolonged litigation. Robert Bristow III, who had initially responded with shock and apologies, became an advocate for historical transparency and restorative justice. He worked with the Portland Historical Society to ensure the full story was told, donated family documents and photographs to help researchers understand the context of Elizabeth's crimes, and established a scholarship fund for descendants of families harmed by the Bristows. He gave interviews discussing the burden of discovering such a dark family history, the process of reconciling inherited identity with historical truth, and the responsibility of descendants to acknowledge and address the harms caused by their ancestors. His willingness to engage honestly with the past, rather than denying or minimizing it, earned respect from many who had initially viewed all Bristows with suspicion and anger. The story of Elizabeth Bristow's diary became a touchstone for discussions about how societies remember their past, how they balance pride in accomplishments with acknowledgement of crimes, and how historical narratives get constructed and reconstructed as new evidence emerges. Portland's experience dealing with the diary's revelations was studied by other cities grappling with similar reckonings about their founders and the sources of their civic wealth. The case raised questions that extended far beyond one woman's crimes, questions about power, gender, justice, memory, and the obligations the present owes to the past. Elizabeth had intended her diary to be a private record of her triumphs, a testament to her intelligence and capability that only she would see. Instead, it became a public document that forced an entire city to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of its prosperity and the real costs of the success it had celebrated for over a century. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.